Awesome. You got it right up, and I'll just tell you to shift when we can. The Green New Deal, as people are probably aware, it's part of an international movement in the United States Congress. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House of Representatives and Ed Markey in the Senate have brought forward very, very similar legislation, but we're also seeing in places like Europe, in the United Kingdom, Asia, South America, we have this international movement for a Green New Deal. The idea being to push forward in the transition towards clean energy and achieving social, economic, and environmental justice. And the similar attempts around the world by parliamentarians and elected representatives all indicate the importance of this issue, because as we are well aware, this planet is burning. And I'll speak to a specific local example that has been very successful, sort of the green up of Europe a little bit later on. So if you can put on the next slide, please. We're well aware of what the climate emergency means. It means the disappearance of whole countries, cities around the world. We're seeing in New Orleans, for example, after the incredible devastation that is partly charged because of the climate emergency, the U.S. Corps of Engineers spent $14 billion erecting a dike, trying to mitigate the climate emergency. We're now finding that the Corps of Engineers is now saying that that $14 billion only buys a few years of survival for the city of New Orleans, and over a dozen countries will disappear if we continue to have the global warming at the stage that we are seeing now. Next slide, please. It's also an incredible impact on the health and well-being of the world's population. The Scientific American and a whole range of other medical journals have indicated the size and scope of the health emergency. So at the same time as we're living through a pandemic that hopefully we will see behind us with the larger distribution of vaccines, the climate change and the climate emergency continues to be a public health emergency that will kill up to 250,000 people a year on our planet over the next decade or two if we do not take action. Next slide, please. And it's also economic costs. The costs in the past year were $5 billion to the Canadian economy. Worldwide, we're talking about economic losses upwards of $500 billion. And the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy basically projects that over the next 29 years, we'll be looking at an annual cost to Canada, the climate emergency, of up to $50 billion. Next slide, please. So to fight back against the climate emergency, to put in place a transition that is on the scale and ambition of the Green New Deal, what we are looking to do is put in place the following principles to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions over the course of the next couple of decades, create the millions of high-wage jobs that come with the investments that are so important to the success of the Green New Deal. And ensuring prosperity and economic security for all Canadians. That means starting and particularly targeting marginalized groups, First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, Canadians, new Canadians, people with disabilities. Marginalized groups are really the front and center and where the investments need to be made to achieve the Green New Deal principles, which are to ensure social, economic, and environmental justice. Next slide, please. So we're talking about a 10-year national mobilization plan. As soon as the Green New Deal is adopted, it will require accompanying legislation, shifts in our budget allocations as well. It's a 10-year national mobilization plan. Jagmeet Singh spoke to this with the NDP's election platform last year, the New Deal for People. What we are looking to achieve is meeting 100% of the power demand in Canada through clean energy sources sources. That means major investments in smart grid right across the country. We've seen in Europe, for example, the Nordic grid that has allowed a variety of clean energy sources to work on that smart grid, the Nordic grid that unites the Scandinavian countries and Germany. It means upgrading buildings to achieve maximal energy efficiency. It means, in short, a real transition from fossil fuels to clean energy sources, and ensuring that the infrastructure is in place so that we can take advantage of that clean energy right across the country. Important thing to note, the building trades have indicated over the next 10 years that the market for clean energy in the United States, despite Mr. Trump and his refusal to allow clean energy at the state level, at the municipal level, we're looking at a quadrupling of the market needs for clean energy in the US alone over the next 10 years. So putting in place a smart grid, ensuring that we have clean energy sources isn't only good for the Canadian economy, it's also remarkably effective for the export market. Next slide, please. And the most important element of this is that Green New Deal must be developed through transparent and inclusive consultation. And that means collaboration and partnership with frontline and vulnerable communities, First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, labor unions, workers' cooperatives, civil society groups, academia, and businesses. Now, I mentioned earlier, a local example, the Green Up of Europe, is the region of Samso. And I'll spell it out for folks if you want to do some research online. It's S-A-M-S and then that funny Danish O with a line through it. So S-A-M-S-O. Samso was really, it's known as the energy archipelago, but it is really the region of Denmark that was the first to transition, in effect, to a Green New Deal. What Samso did is start at the community level. They actually started with public consultations across the region. People from the region stepped up, and what they did is they started going into the bottom of their drawers, they went into their socks, they found enough money to start building the clean energy infrastructure. And the assistance that they got from the Danish government at the time was to put in place educational programs to allow for retraining of workers. This has changed Samso from what was an economically disadvantaged region to now a region that is leading Denmark in terms of growth, and they have entirely transitioned both in their energy, but also through district energy and biofuels, their district heating as well, and their transportation sector. So Samso has shown the economic viability of starting from the grassroots, starting from the bottom up, starting from the community based, and then building a clean energy economy from that. Thank you, Sean. The next slide, please. So those requirements of what is fundamental to the Green New Deal include ensuring a democratic and participatory processes. Certainly Samso is a great indication of that. Ensuring that we're enacting trade rules with strong labor and environmental protections as well. And ensuring high quality union jobs and strengthening the rights of all workers. What we want to do, what we need to do if we're to achieve social, economic, and environmental justice is ensuring that the most marginalized groups in society are the first ones that are served by this transition to a Green New Deal. Next slide, please. So we have tabled it in Parliament. It's motion M1, supported by the NDP caucus, also by Green members of Parliament. And I'll come back to this in a moment. A few members of Parliament, even from the Liberals. What we have decided in terms of strategy is to put it forward and to work with community networks across the country and activists across the country to put pressure on their local members of Parliament. And we have found slowly but surely, despite COVID and despite the fact that mobilization is more difficult at this time, that we are slowly but surely putting pressure on members of Parliament so that they will actually support the Green New Deal. And I'll give you the example of Mike MacLeod, who's a Liberal member of Parliament from the Northwest Territories, was visited half a dozen times prior to COVID by local activists who pushed him eventually from being somewhat skeptical of the Green New Deal to say that he will vote for it. We now have about 30 members of Parliament supporting the Green New Deal. We want to achieve that majority in the House, and so it is that continued pressure from activists across the country and environmental groups that ultimately will speak to the success of getting the Green New Deal through Parliament. We're not at that stage yet. And COVID has, I think, in a certain extent, delayed some of that activism that will be so important. But it's the call to action. It's people signing the petition, getting involved in community groups, joining 350.org, which is one of the many environmental organizations across the country who have endorsed the Green New Deal, and getting your friends, family, neighbors to actually support the Green New Deal as well. And the next slide, please. If you want further information, you can get to my website, peterjulian.ca. You can also email us at peter.julian.c1@parl.gc.ca. This is not something that's going to be adopted next week or next month, but we're seeing the long term. And so far, after this being tabled over the past year, we've seen some important strides. We're going to have to keep that work going so that we can achieve the transition that Canada needs to achieve, both for our country, but also for the future of this planet. So thanks to everyone for being willing to watch this, and thanks so much, Sean, for giving me the opportunity to promote what we think is very fundamentally important legislation.